Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called nondual Shiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. For this episode of the podcast, I am once again joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Shamil Chandaria. For his bio, please see our previous conversation on the podcast, which is episode 34. Shamil does impressive work in many areas, especially neuroscience, meditation, psychedelics, AI, and the study of eudaimonia, or human flourishing. Here we have an in-depth conversation on all of those topics. I think you'll find it fascinating. We discuss the nature of reality at the deepest level, such as it can be known by us humans. And if you're interested in Shamil's thoughts on the current state of AI and where it's headed, that's at the end of this conversation. Enjoy. I'm here once again with Shamil Chandaria, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you on the podcast again. Thank you for being here.
Oh, Hareesh, it's a great pleasure. And, of course, in the interim, you and I have had lots of conversations and interaction. But really looking forward to this.
Yeah, and we were just speaking for a minute before we started recording, and I was saying to Shamil, I am so happy that you are embracing your true nature as a polymath, meaning to say that you can really speak quite brilliantly about not only neuroscience, but also meditation, metaphysics, philosophy, mystical experience, psychedelic experience, AI, and on several other topics as well. So you're really exhibiting that more fully in this recent course that you recorded, and that's called Rewiring Your Reality. So we're going to put a link to that for people because it's really an amazing course on neuroscience, meditation, and awakening. And I'm also hoping that you're gonna, write a book on this subject. There's a lot to talk about. So let me just start with, what are you most excited about? What are you most interested in? And what is affecting you, impacting you the most these days, both intellectually and spiritually, and in any other domain?
Okay, great. Well, yeah, that's kind of a big question. Maybe let's start with this course that I gave earlier in the summer, and then we can kind of go from there. So, to some extent, the course is a kind of culmination of many years of thinking about these issues: meditation, awakening, liberation, from a scientific perspective and from a practice perspective. And it is really trying to bridge or give bridges between science and spirituality. And not just bridges between science and spirituality, but also philosophical bridges. How do we understand what's going on in an awakening process? How do we understand what's going on in liberation? How do we understand what's going on in liberation from a Western psychological perspective, from Western philosophical perspective of Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics? How do we understand what's going on um, from a metaphysical perspective, all these kind of things. So, I mean, the basic, just to recap the kind of core structure, and then we can move on to other things. Um, it was split into four parts. The first part was very scientific and very neuroscience heavy, which was so the idea was, how do we construct our reality, our experience? Um, and this was a sort of no holds barred idea that we're constructing everything, not just all kind of typical phenomena, visual phenomena, and auditory phenomena, and all that, but we're constructing our emotions, we're constructing our sense of self, we're constructing space and time and everything else. So there wasn't, much else. And then, so that was week one, about, how this works and how it works. We talked about this last time on the podcast, so I won't go through that. But talking about it from a predictive processing point of view. And then week two was, okay, so how do we work with that in meditation? And week two is really about awakening. So, awakening to the nature of the generative model. What does this really mean for our entire perspective, and how waking up within our generative world model gives us this ability to um, start to restructure ourselves. And then that leads to week three, which was essentially on liberation and human flourishing. And that is all about reconstructing our patterns. Um, and I take this kind of from a view without not from a Buddhist perspective, not from a Hindu perspective, not from any particular lineages. It was really this idea of, how do we understand it using all of the lenses, scientific lenses, psychological lenses, Western philosophical lenses, and Eastern spiritual contemplative tradition lenses.
Yeah,
And
and let me just mention briefly that we could say that what you're doing is a more sophisticated 21st century version of Huxley's perennial philosophy, which is really, really interesting. Because his articulation was great for its time, but nowhere near sophisticated enough. And you're doing a similar thing, but with a lot more detail and spanning a lot more disciplines.
yeah, actually, well, that's a really good point. We might as well go there, just to talk a little bit about the perennial philosophy, because I think it'll be relevant, and it will give a flavor. Um, the perennial philosophy is this idea that somehow all the spiritual traditions are um, climbing up the same mountain, getting to the same mountaintop, mountain peak, but have different paths up the mountain. And, you know, in this kind of week three, we talk about the idea that, well, actually, there are different attractor basins that we can reconstruct to, slightly different. I mean, spiritual traditions have some core commonalities, but they also have different vibes, different moods and tastes. You can go towards equanimity, or the bodhisattva ideal, or Sufi awe and reverence, or Christian love, or many different flavors, endpoints. You can just say, no, it's all about becoming a rainbow body, uh, and and so we might say that actually that's interesting, because that starts to poke a hole in the perennial philosophy view, that maybe it's not just one mountaintop. Maybe it's kind of a mountain range, and many paths, many mountaintops, but one mountain range. Now, the problem with that analogy of the or update on the perennial philosophy is that it kind of slightly throws the baby out with the bathwater, because there is something that all the traditions deconstruct to. there is some, um, we can call it a minimal phenomenal experience or a pure awareness experience or some sort of cessation, some sort of ground of being, or perhaps groundless ground that everything deconstructs to. And so that idea is not sort of coming through. So then we go to this, I mean, these analogies have been made before, but then there's another analogy that maybe what we're talking about is, well, maybe it's many rivers down to one ocean. All right. But that's also not quite right because there are different endpoints to this. And so then we get to a sort of more sophisticated analogy in the end, which is many rivers flowing down to a single ocean with different beach settlements that can be made around the ocean. And so we're in touch with the ocean, but there are different settlements that we can inhabit. And this is this kind of a more modern version, more kind of postmodern spirituality that
But to use your language, we could say it's a single ocean with multiple attractor basins in its ocean floor, in its depths for people to explore.
right, exactly. Except the attractor basins are ways to manifest, are patterns that we would want to develop, and so to some extent they're on the coast. They're that the ocean is pure nothingness, but the reconstruction is, and we want to live close to the ocean. We want to have a daily dip in the ocean.
But isn't it true that we actually never leave the ocean?
That's right. I mean, actually, of course, what we're really saying here is that the ocean is Shiva, and Shakti is um, the land trajectories. In other words, the manifestation areas. And so the idea is that there is a single Shiva, but many different patterns of Shakti that we can choose to abide in.
Okay, so this is definitely giving rise to questions, but first let me just go back to your four-part course because the first week was on constructing our reality, and I have a question about that later. The second week was on deconstructing self, the self we think we are, and the world as we think it is. And that deconstructing is also called awakening in more positive terms, but it's the same,
Yeah.
right? And then week three was on liberation and reconstruction, like becoming liberated from our conditioning, our karma, our habit patterns, and creating a new way of being in the world, which is only possible subsequent to a movement of awakening.
Yeah, exactly. And that week three, we sort of dovetail that into a modern conception of human flourishing.
Yes, and then you continue with that in week four, which is on human flourishing and deeper awakenings, and sort of the endless end of the journey.
Right, and the metaphysics. And actually, that in week four, it's very interesting because you know we talk about these three levels of awakening, which actually map onto this is obviously highly influenced by your discussion of it, but I've given a kind of modern secular perspective on that. Three levels. Well, I wouldn't say secular particularly, but non-lineage perspective. Um, and they really map onto your description of the three levels of awakening. Um, yeah,
Cool, cool. So, yeah, so again, that course is called Rewiring Your Reality, and it's released through Adventures in Awareness. So
yeah,
I'm sure some of the listeners are going to check that out.
yeah,
But here's okay. Here's my first question. um, Now, neuroscience has given us, through you and people like Ruben, neuroscientist has given us perhaps the most robust explanation of awakening that comes from outside these traditions, these that go back to antiquity. And you've talked about down weighting top level priors, meaning, to put it simply, are entrenched beliefs and assumptions about reality, softening those, relaxing those by whatever means, such that we can drop down to something more fundamental, our somatic and sensual experience, free or relatively free of interpretation. And that you've described brilliantly how that all makes sense within the Bayesian brain model. So this leads me to the question: do you think that neuroscience will end up explaining, or at least modeling, all aspects of the awakening and liberation process, or do you think that there will remain aspects of it that are unexplainable by science?
Yeah, no, no, great question. So first of all, um, you will have seen from the way that the course ends that I really once again end up talking about the elephant in the blind, and that even the story that we've just told is just a story. It's just a lens. So I would say neuroscience is a very powerful lens, uh, and I consider it. I value it from a pragmatic perspective because it allows us to understand what's going on in awakening, as you say, and that may be helpful for people's journeys for their spiritual development. Um, so, having said that, I would say that there are limitations um, with this perspective because it's just a single perspective. The sort of too fast critique of it would be, oh, this is all just materialism, scientific materialism. This is not really getting the kind of deeper issue. You know, uh, scientists just think that there's a physical world with billiard balls banging in, some sort of 19th century view of physics. That's too fast. So that would not be a criticism that I would think is valid. Um, this scientific perspective is independent of any metaphysical assumptions. Really sophisticated idealists like Bernardo Kastrup um, recognize that uh, idealism is just as scientific as modern day materialism or physicalism. And so, in one sense, even if you think the world is just this dance of ultimate reality, which is in some sense uh, consciousness or continuous with consciousness, um, it, this would be how we are describing this ultimate reality. So I would say that's not going to be an appropriate criticism. However, there is one part of the discussion which in a sense neuroscience has to be silent on, which is essentially the notion of the heart problem. Um, uh, there is something rather miraculous going on here that we can even have an experience. And that, I think, ultimately, our only way of talking about these issues is a philosophical issue. It's fundamentally philosophical, and so that I normally say that roughly speaking, there's one miracle going on, which is that there is something rather than nothing, or that there is experience, and 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 that's so central to ultimately what is recognized on a spiritual path. And I think that to some extent, of course, neuroscience doesn't really say anything about that. I think we shouldn't expect it to. as I said, because it's ultimately a philosophical issue. And I think actually Bernardo puts it interesting. He's become quite interested recently in integrated information theory, and I also have a lot of respect for it, into IIT. And these frameworks, these different lenses, are are not uh, um, contradictory. They're just different levels of explanation. Integrated information doesn't say what the information is doing. It's just saying the brain is processing information, and somehow the information is entangled with itself, so that the informational nexus, the entangled informational web, somehow is so entangled that it knows itself, aka Vimarsha, for those who are cognoscenti in that
Mhm.
language. And what Bernardo says is that, look, he thinks that IIT is the closest thing we have to a theory of the noumenon. I mean, he's using this distinction that Immanuel Kant came up, which is that the world of our experience is the phenomenal world. This is the world that we kind of, our reality as we experience it. But to some extent, there is um, reality in which our experiences are arising, the ultimate reality, which we can say nothing of. We only know our own phenomenal world. And he called that the thing in itself, or the noumenal reality. And so, to some extent, there is this idea that what science is trying to do is give us a map of this ultimate noumenal reality. I think it is not describing ultimate reality, it's just giving us a map, um, how to connect the ultimate reality to our phenomenal world. Because, of course, everything science is saying is simply in our own experience. I mean, when we measure something, we're seeing a dial move up, left or right, or numbers on a computer screen. This is entering our sensory experience. So science is actually ultimately, even though it's trying to model ultimate reality, it's really modeling it and giving us a map within our phenomenal world. So that's how, what I would say is that, look, in terms of the deepest, most ultimate questions, I think we have to move beyond science.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So maybe we'll return to this Kantian distinction of noumenon and phenomenon later. But one thing I wanted to come to was this notion of experience as a controlled hallucination, as a mental construct, or a consciousness construct, if you prefer, that is constrained by the data of the so-called external world, right? Which again could be also called the noumenon, right? The data as it is in itself prior to our um, experience of it, right, is what's constraining, according to this model, um, our fabrication, our mental construct, or our so-called hallucination of reality. And this is interesting to me because I'm wondering if this is really ontologically different from what the tantric tradition says, um, because the tantric tradition wants to deny that there is a fundamental dualism, like say between noumenon and phenomenon, but world as it is in itself and that which we experience. That would be a kind of fundamental dualism that they want to avoid positing, right? So what they argue, these past masters of classical tantra, is that well, it's a theological statement, but Shakti likes to dance in a patterned way, that she loves pattern. Like the pattern can be complex, it can even appear chaotic to us in our limited perspective, but it is nonetheless patterned, it's orchestrated, and it's orchestrated beautifully for those who have the eyes to see. But the point here is that it all boils down to the question of why can we agree on things as different, loci of consciousness? Why can we why do we agree that we're perceiving the same thing? And what is that constraint, so-called constraint, that's giving rise to a consensus experience? Is it that there's something prior to perception that's constraining the experience, or this alternative explanation is that Shakti loves to dance in a patterned way, and that and that her pattern instantiates as everything that we can agree on in experience, but also as the unique features of experience, because that's sort of the fringe elements of the pattern, um, and that there's one consciousness perceiving itself, perceiving this whole pattern, and that provides the coordination that allows us to speak meaningfully and agree about things. So I don't know if I stated it all
Yeah,
that well, but you get my point. They're trying to say, no, there's no world as it is in itself outside of our perception. It's just that since Shakti moves in a patterned way, that is the so-called constraint which allows us to agree on things.
yeah, yeah. So this is a very important point, and we've talked about this in the past a little bit. And I think there's probably a difference here between um, between our models a little bit. I'm a little bit more like Bernardo. If I was an idealist, I would be an objective idealist. What you described is something a slightly a different version. So let me sketch out this one picture that I kind of see it as, which is there is only one thing, which is reality, the goddess, the universe, whatever you want to call it. It is, in a sense, uh, dancing and animating within itself, vibrating. And so, one picture, you might think of is like a field of experience in the sort of physics way, like quantum fields. But like, let's just be, like, for example, just think of it like a river that's flowing, one massive river, which is the entirety of reality. Now, in this river, um, as evolution happened, there started to evolve little whirlpools in this river, and these little whirlpools are individuals. And one of the things about when you've got a whirlpool that continues, it ends up getting an information theoretic structure called a Markov blanket. Not you don't need to worry about that. But the point is that this little whirlpool starts to have a little model within itself of itself and the environment. Okay, so now we got this one river which is just flowing within itself. There is only the river. There is no such thing as whirlpools kind of independent of the river. Whirlpools are just patterns within the river. However, these whirlpools start to develop this internal model to allow them to survive, to continue as a whirlpool, which includes itself and everything else going on. So let's say there's a tree being represented in the river, and then there's a whirlpool, and there's another whirlpool A, and then whirlpool B, whirlpool Alice and whirlpool Bob. Now, Whirlpool Alice has got an internal Alice model, a little mini me internal Alice model. And here's the funny thing: this internal Alice model takes itself to be that little model rather than the whirlpool. That's because little Alice is in samsara. But
Yeah, yeah. Just really quick, does Alice take herself to be her own model of herself? Does Alice take herself to be the mini me, or is it just the mini me thinking it's Alice, the
Yes.
real Alice, or is that saying the same thing?
Yeah, so yeah, this is basically the exactly right, that within the generative model of the Alice whirlpool is a submodel called the um, phenomenal self model of Alice, and that phenomenal self model of Alice uh, constructs all Alice's thoughts and sort of thinks that it is the real Alice.
Right,
But of course, it's just contained within Alice's awareness.
right,
Now, so you got little Alice, and then you got the tree. Alice can see the tree, so there's a little mini representation of the tree within Alice's world model as well. Now, Bob also sees. Bob has a little self model of Bob, and also a self model of Alice, and also a self model of the tree. And since they're similar whirlpools, they probably will perceive the tree in broadly similar ways, although chinks in the matrix occur all the time. The famous example is or the infamous example is the dress, which was either gold and white for some people and blue and black for others. So that, these are perceptual differences, but mostly we paper over these differences that we do find. So now the really interesting thing is that this is sort of the objective idealist perspective. Now, I could also, because I I generally tend to hold all the metaphysical positions and I'm open to them all. So I could say that, well, it's not a river of consciousness; it's a river of some neutral reality substance, and consciousness is one of the properties that it has. This would be more, this would be more like Spinoza's kind of neutral monism. Or I could say, oh, it's just physical reality, except there's only one thing I would say is that we have no idea what physical reality is. But one of the thing is that somehow its nature is that it produces conscious experience. So it's a bit more difficult to make physicalism work, but basically, as long as you're humble enough to not know what physical reality is, these metaphysical positions tend to get closer to each other as you become more humble. Now, the difference, I think, let's come down to the difference that I think between our positions. So I would describe this river position as a kind of a modern objective idealist or objective physicalist view. And there is an understanding of the noumenal, which is just the river, the whole river, and uh, the phenomenal world, Alice's phenomenal world, and Bob's phenomenal world. Now, in the past, you have kind of said, well, maybe it's just a union. Just imagine just the whirlpools. And there is no river apart from the whirlpools. And it's just that because we kind of get the union of the sets of whirlpools and it's a single Shakti, somehow we can kind of coordinate, construct a coherent river model. And that is an older, that I forget what it's called. I think it's a kind of more Berkeleyan idealism, which in the 20th century, most idealists are now objective idealists. So that's an older version of idealism, but it is one that was there. So I think that's a kind of perhaps a metaphysical difference between us.
yeah, maybe. It's hard to get at what we're actually trying to represent with these words, what experience the words are seeking to represent, and whether the experience is actually different. Um, okay, so the idea that there's only whirlpools, that's perhaps better stated as reality is the sum total of all conscious experiences had by conscious perceivers, right? The sum total in all space and time of all the experiences had by whatever perceivers exist. So it includes the aliens experience if there are aliens, and right. So and I think that's perfectly possible. It's perfectly possible that it could be true, but it's also perfectly possible that there are bits of the river that are not whirlpools, right? But then you have to ask, what's the unifying principle?
I think that Kashmiri Shaivism is compatible with this a more objective position that I'm giving, because I would say that the river, the unifying principle is all prakasha, the light of awareness. However, only the whirlpools have a sophisticated vimarsha going on, a reflexivity. So only the whirlpools kind of know that they know, and the information feeds back. But it's made of the same water which is illuminated by the light of awareness. So it's made of water. It's all water, but water has to kind of informationally entangle with itself to know that it knows, and that's the magic of vimarsha.
Yeah, yeah. And so, as far as that goes, your view is the same as Bernardo's view, which I'm totally sympathetic to, and I don't know if we have the means to establish the nature of ultimate reality with certainty ever, but I wouldn't be shocked at all to find out that that's right, meaning to say there's one cosmic consciousness, for lack of a better word, mind at large, Bernardo calls it, because it sounds less 70s if you say it that way. And then, and so the quote unquote mental processes or movements within that cosmic consciousness that are not part of an individual vantage point, meaning to say that are not perceived by condensed loci of awareness like you and me, that those movements of consciousness are not don't have vimarsha involved, right? So because that cosmic consciousness is not a mind in the way we despite Bernardo's use of the term mind at large, it's not a mind as we understand mind, something that can think about itself, right? Um, until it embodies, until it becomes a condensed locus, which is to say, an embodied vantage point of itself on itself. So yeah, I'm not bothered personally about whether there are bits of prakasha that don't vimarsha,
Yeah.
rather, which is to say, like bits of the river that are not whirlpools. Um, but I come back to this question of, you know, what is our explanation of why we both perceive, I don't know, an orange sitting on the table, right? And we agree on most of the features of that orange. Ultimately, of course, we can't know, like what I'm calling the color orange, which is given its name by the fruit, or the other way around. I don't know. What I'm calling the color orange could be what you call the color blue, and vice versa. And if they're exactly vice versa, we would never know the difference. Which,
Yeah.
everyone who
Okay.
tried to do philosophy in high school thought about that. But my point is, that aside, we can agree on many, 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 many features, and we can even talk about the experience of eating the orange, though it's hard to represent direct experience in words. We can talk about it in such a way that we find commonality that suggests to us that we're having substantially the same or even exactly the same experience. So the materialist view, right, is that, well, that's happening because there's data outside of conscious experience that's constraining the nature of conscious experience. Um, Whereas, a tantric view, which might end up just being a theological way to say the same thing, I don't know, but I think it's not, because it's like Shakti loves to commune with Shiva, right? So the Shiva being consciousness and Shakti being qualia, right? The content of experience here, and there's no real communion unless these different loci of experience, such as you and me, are bridging the apparent gap and recognizing, oh, we are one and the same consciousness, experiencing the same thing from different vantage points. So um,
So that's
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 the yeah.
excellent. Okay, so this I understand the question now. Thank you. This is this is good, and this is actually rich. This will take us into um, genuine new territory for spiritual traditions and science. And so the thing is that this idea that we see the same orange because, in some sense, it's a the Shakti is kind of trying to unify, have this, create this wonderfully um, coherent experience, so that because it is one being versus
One being who loves to commune with itself because it's blissful.
right versus the sort of the other perspective, which is that there is one river, but we have different perspectives of this one river. In a sense, this is also the same thing. This is essentially saying that the one reality has multiple viewpoints upon herself. So this is the universe. We are all the entire universe from viewing itself from finite perspectives. And of course, what we would expect is that we would get slightly different perceptions, even possibly. Um, uh, we saw through the blue and the dress, quite different perceptions, but certainly different perspectives. And of course, this seems to, now I'm going to say, what is the better story? I'm a pragmatist, so I'm not looking at the truth. I'm saying, what's a good story? I say that I love the Kashmir Shiva's story, but I think, and it's very poetic, but I think that to some extent, Occam's razor will say that actually a more beautiful story is the goddess has got multiple viewpoints upon herself, and that these viewpoints broadly cohere, partly because A, we have similar biology, B, we are interested in the same thing. Oranges feed us, and when we don't have oranges, we die. So we have these kind of similar ways of looking at C, the sensory data compresses in the same way. Now, this is a bit of a technical thing, but basically, you can feed data into a neural network which knows nothing of the world. It doesn't know oranges, it doesn't know faces, it doesn't know cats. And as you compress the data and force it to go into something called an informational bottleneck, in other words, represent the data in as parsimonious and economical way as possible, it will come up with, inverted commas, some objects, and then just play with those objects. And one of the objects it will come up with is a face. Who would have thought that something that was never told what a face is ends up getting a neuron which represents a face. And when there's a face, it's on, and when there's no face, it's not on. It also ends up getting this is a network trained on YouTube data, so it also ends up getting a neuron for a cat, because there's a lot of cats on YouTube. And so the thing is that this just says, look, the most economical and parsimony. If you had to represent the world in a small flower box, you would put the prettiest flowers in the flower box. In other words, the flowers with the most explanatory, with the most explanatory power. What for? For perception and action. Perception is representing it, but ultimately for the purpose of action. In other words, doing actions to survive, eating food, procreating. So it turns out that we are going to form similar representations. So we can actually show this. And the interesting thing is, the reason why I say it's a better story is because we've actually tested this story on presumably something that doesn't have vimarsha, a lot of it maybe. We can come on to this, which is AI. we've actually seen that AI forms the same representations. Very early AI, without any language, forms the same representations as us. And in fact, in something called a convolutional neural network, which is just sort of trying to do image recognition, it ends up creating early receptor fields which of the same type that we find in the primary visual cortex, just noting edges and corners, because evolution came up with the same way of compressing the data as the AI. Why? Because there is a optimal way to compress the data, and ultimately mathematically there's an optimal way. So this is an interesting point that I would say that here is something that science can actually help us say that, look, if we had to have many different interpretations of Kashmir Shaivism, which were open to us, we might say let's the one the sort of one that I was kind of going for. I mean, not on historical grounds. That's your territory, but on in terms of like what interpretation actually coheres with the way we're currently looking at the world, knowing that we know. I mean, they never have the opportunity to test their ideas of perception on artificial neural networks without human consciousness, but we do.
Okay, let's see if we can get somewhere here with all this, because so far, I would say you haven't contradicted the view of Shaivism at all. You said, well, here's a better story, but you didn't provide a different story as of yet, because Shaivism also says that there's all these unique vantage points that consciousness has on itself, and those are what we call individuals, even though they're not actually an individual, right? An entity unto itself. Um, and in a way, you know, there's an interesting thing that happened in your discourse there, because first, you were suggesting that biology is a constraint that helps explain why we can agree on what we're perceiving. But then you went to AI,
Yeah.
which obviously doesn't have biology. So, in my view, you ended up making an argument that actually strengthens my position, because Shakti loves pattern, and she will instantiate the pattern in whatever substrate, in the biological substrate or in the AI substrate, the silicon substrate, if we want to call it that, because she innately and instinctively, we could say, creates patterns that allow for consciousness to commune with itself, and that's what's happening,
Yeah.
whether it's got a mechanical or a carbon meat based substrate.
Now I'm really loving this because uh, uh, I totally agree. First, let me just make the link. Remember, biology and evolution is trying to do optimal perception. There's a mathematically optimal way of doing that, just called Bayesian inference. It's kind of there's a mathematical optimal way of trying to figure out what's going on. And artificial intelligence is basically using that same mathematics, in fact, right? So now we get to the deeper point, which is that um, ultimately we're talking about almost a Platonic realm, and this is the realm, I think, of Shakti. This is the realm of, she is the actual manifestation of the Platonic realm, which is the potentiality of Shiva. And where the Platonic realm, for those like, for example, where do numbers live? Even if there wasn't manifestation, there might be numbers. This is the some people aren't Platonists, but many mathematicians tend to be Platonists, and I kind of feel like it's got a spiritual vibe for me, which is that that somehow nothingness is pregnant with all of this potential structure out there, and that Shakti is tuning into this exactly biologically and with AI, the same ultimate um, patterns. The fact that there can that the way, the optimal way to compress data, or just very basic things, the platonic solids or the prime numbers, they're just ultimately always there, even if there was no manifestation. And so this is wonderful. I love it.
Yeah, and the process of Bayesian inference, we can understand that as the process of discerning the fundamental patterns of Shakti from an embodied perspective, right? So, in other words, we can talk about Bayesian inference in terms of what the brain is doing and everything, but Shaivism takes a more meta view, which is, well, prior to biology itself, like why does consciousness manifest this experience for itself of having a physical body with a physical brain? Because that's in a way the medium for the pattern discernment that, from your perspective, or from a neuroscience perspective, we're calling Bayesian inference, right? But what is that other than vimarsha? What is that other than, you know consciousness in embodied form, which is Shiva Shakti, uh, exploring itself, discerning itself?
Absolutely right. Absolutely brilliant. You know, in fact, I would want to sort of take a um, let's actually take a cosmic point of view on this, which is this whole cosmic experience, this whole universe, or all the multiverses, or whatever reality is simply this exploration, um, where the infinite is exploring its full possibility sets. So through manifestation, through Shakti. And what do we see? We see Vimarsha. It took billions of years to get the first kind of, you know, um, sort of information knowing itself. We don't know where it was, where a manifestation first recognized itself and fed back onto itself to say the first kind of um, I know I am aware. So we don't know where that happened phylogenetically or even before life or whatever. But you can think of it that all the way through for 13.8 billion years, it's getting more and more self-aware. So in one sense, um, and looking back at the rest of the the cosmos and saying, so we've got a little island of awareness and a little island of inertia that's essentially the whole that's woken up and looks back onto itself and say, I can now see myself from this finite perspective. And there's a sort of a deeper point which I've always tuned into, which is the infinite can always know itself as the infinite, as this utter perfection, this utter simplicity, just everything. But for it to really fully know itself, it has to know itself through its unfoldings, not perfectly, because if everything happened, that would just simply be the infinite, but from a finite point of view. So for it to fully know itself, the infinite has to know itself from many, many finite viewpoints. And you could sort of think of that as this whole process of what's going on um, in the universe.
Absolutely, and that could be taken to imply a teleological end goal where the universe finally has finished knowing itself. It now knows itself. And that's wrong. Of course, we both agree on that. That it,
Well, I don't know. I
okay,
mean,
okay,
I'm going to be controversial. I've got a lot to say about teleology.
okay. So let me finish the point, and then you can disagree if you like. Um, that that from my perspective and from Shaivism's perspective, consciousness explores itself, seeks to know itself only because it loves that. It loves the process of coming to know itself, not because it has in its viewfinder an end goal of when it will finally have finished knowing itself, right? So in other words, it's not so that consciousness is doing this so that it reaches whatever point, but just because that's what it loves to do. And since if that's the truth, then we can expect that there is no end point, that it will endlessly explore itself, and that if potentiality is infinite, then the range of manifestation is infinite, and it will never finish exploring itself, which is great for it because that's what it loves to do. So do you disagree with that?
I actually agree with a lot of what you say. I just have more to add. I feel, um, uh, I think that it is an endless play. It is play, and I love it. So let's just again for the audience make this distinction between Aristotle's. He actually had four types of causes, but the two important ones is sort of the efficient cause, what we in modern scientific discourse normally call causality today, and teleological explanation, which is so a efficient cause. A teleological explanation would be like a plant grows towards the sunlight, which is a good explanation actually. The efficient causation is no, 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 no. You're making it all mysterious. No, no. Sunlight um, impacts certain cellular sort of tropin factors on one side of the plant, which causes the growth to increase on one side of the plant and the other side, and then it kind of tends to, yeah, it ends up tending. So these are two different types of explanation. And what really happened was that teleology got poo-pooed because essentially the church had teleological type explanations, and um, uh, as the scientific age arose, and these type of explanations were generally thought of as unscientific. But actually, there is still a lot of vestiges of teleology. And and of course, where it's most prominent, which is hiding in plain sight, is in the second law of thermodynamics. Okay, that in fact the universe tends towards more disorder, and a weird consequence of the second law of thermodynamics away from equilibrium, in far from equilibrium systems, like where you got a sun next to you giving you a lot of what's called free energy, um, is that you tend to get islands of complexity forming, which actually end up being better dissipation, creating more entropy. Now, the reason I say this is because this is not unconnected to the increase in complexity of life, and ecosystems like the Earth and things like that. It is these thermodynamic gradients that are driving it. And so you might say, there is a longer argument here, but you might say that in fact, Vimersha is on the cards. That's talking teleology, in the sense that it was inevitable that in the exploration of the universe by itself, you will get more complex structures where information will be more integrated. In other words, more consciousness and so the idea is that that process will carry on and on. Now, in some sense, what we're saying is that I think we need to rehabilitate the idea of teleology to say that actually it looks like there is a purpose. So if you go back 100 years, most people would say life is a completely highly unlikely random accident in the universe, and like it's kind of nothing to do with the central story of the cosmos. It's like some sort of weird and we live in this cold, dark, meaningless universe. That was the general view from the existentialists in the early 20th century and mid 20th century. I think we're actually shifting the zeitgeist here, and I see this amongst my scientific colleagues as well. And I think a lot of it had to do with work of Stuart Kaufman and many others at Santa Fe, where actually we're starting to find that there is really this scientific basis for this more optimistic view. You might even say kind of spiritual perspective, where no, we are actually central to what's going on in the cosmos somehow. There's little glimmers of the anthropic principle here, and there's all sorts of other things that somehow the universe is slightly fine-tuned, perhaps even some people say, towards creating life. So I would interestingly say that I think that I totally agree. I agree with everything that you said. I would just go even further, that says that, Shiva Shakti absolutely want to not just explore their possibilities, but become more and more ecstatic in their dance and recognize themselves more and more from multiple perspectives. That dance may never end, but it may approximate what Teilhard de Chardin called the omega point, which looked like an end point. But perhaps we can just say maybe the universe is awakening more and more and more. Maybe there's no end to that, though.
Okay.
Crazy stuff.
Interesting, interesting. So we might be using the term teleology in a little bit different sense because you could use it in the sense of there being a vector, that there is a definite vector as opposed to just, randomness or changing vector all the time. Um, and of course, there is a vector, and entropy is our way of talking about the vectored nature of the universe, right? Which obviously includes the arrow of time as well. Um, and I was using teleology in the maybe more theological sense of that the argument about whether the universe or God or consciousness is trying to get somewhere, is trying to reach a particular point, an end point or whatever, that I certainly deny, and the tradition denies. Um, but you offer another possibility, right? That rather than having an endpoint in mind of, you know, a certain degree of ecstasy, that it just seeks to become more and more ecstatic. And I would dispute that point because I think Shiva and Shakti are already infinitely blissful. They can't get more ecstatic. All that can happen is that you can more fully realize their ecstasy, which is a beautiful thing, right? So
Or multiple viewpoints on Shiva and Shakti recognize their ecstatic dance.
yes, yes. And but I would dispute the idea that maybe you don't have, that consciousness, as it were, wants everyone to wake up to this truth, and then it's done its job, right? Because that always is going to imply that divine perfection isn't already here, that there's a more perfect situation coming. And I definitely deny that, again, speaking as the representative of the tradition, um, as well as my own personal convictions, because they're not really different when it comes to saying things in words. However, I agree that the fact of entropy, and you just alluded to a whole lot of interesting talk that we don't have time to get into, of how creating complex systems is actually a way for entropy to do what it does, right? Which is very interesting. But um, the fact of there being entropy doesn't, to me, imply teleology, like it's trying to get somewhere, because I think that's just how Shakti's pattern plays itself out,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
It is we could call it subjectivity unfolding, or we could call it the unfolding of embodied cosmic consciousness, whatever we call it. That it has to have a means for its unfolding, for its self exploration,
Yeah.
And so entropy just provides the context within which patterns can play out that allow for that self exploration.
I I I love this, and I tend to hold my views very lightly, but just for the sake of an interesting um, dialogue to explore, and for the listeners to listen to engage with, why don't I take this sort of stick to the teleological guns and actually defend the idea that it's all perfection because let's suppose that the universe is exploring itself and becoming more and more awakened to itself, so it gets more and more perspectives on itself and sees itself from an infinite number of perspectives, and and of course, these are infinities we're talking about, so maybe that's never in finite time. Maybe that's a vanishing point or a limit or something like that. But here's the interesting point that others have made, and I'll make it. It relies on a few things. I mean, the first person to kind of really come up with this kind of view in Western, no, maybe it wasn't the first person, but anyway, Nietzsche, weirdly, had this idea that this was, if at some point in the universe, the entire universe is singing. He wouldn't have used the word hallelujah because he was very anti-Christian. But if everything is just one massive hallelujah, all beings are just kind of in this ecstatic hallelujah from finite perspectives, then what it would mean, and this is now using this idea of the block universe, there is only time is kind of an illusion. So everything that's leading up to this hallelujah is actually a part of creating that hallelujah. And if they're in this kind of timeless, for what's called block universe, this being above time, seeing time as just this landscape of space and time out there already, just reality. This entire landscape has this hallelujah peak going from pure nothingness of Shiva all the way through to Shiva Shakti in exploring the totality of their perspectives and being awake from all their finite perspectives. It would all be perfection.
Let me hit you with this. Since you mentioned block universe, right? So that's just the totality of everything in space time, right? The whole history of the universe, including the bits that we don't have access to because they're in the future from our perspective, right? Also known as the space time loaf, right? um, I would propose that that is the hallelujah.
Yes, I
All of it.
agree.
That it's not, but it's there's not. We're not moving towards that peak because the entire expression we call space time and all its features, the entire block universe, that is the hallelujah. That is consciousness singing a single note of infinite nuance and complexity in celebration of itself.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I agree. I agree on both levels. I mean, in the sense of like directly with you that even every vibration and pulsation is just a celebration of itself, of and but I would also want to have this other perspective that to some extent we might see the world and that there is appears to be a lot of suffering. These are very this was a point that Leibniz, I guess, engaged with, that um, you know nature is, I mean, 99% of all species have been wiped out, and there's terrible suffering, and you might think, well, how on earth is that the hallelujah? But it's part of this one block universe, which is it's this is how um, this 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 is how the universe is exploring itself. And so these are heavy waters, because this is all to do with the problem of evil. But like, I'm actually, like, I think that's why it's worth holding on to this second view, which is not just that every vibration and pulsation of Shakti is just the celebration of of the one upon the one, of its manifestation capacities, but that there is actually a wider pattern that's going on, and that we can actually see that, sometimes we see that, like, oh, isn't it, how we watch a sort of beautiful nature documentary, and we kind of say, oh no, poor gazelle got killed by the cheetah. But like, the cheetah is her cubs are starving, and like, that's also and this whole poignant drama is part of the beauty. But it gets even more poignant if we think that this is somehow, in some sort of timeless way, the necessary part, the sort of price of some even more development, like a better, a more evolved species, or ultimately the entire cosmos awakening to itself. It's a story. These are all stories.
Yeah, I think the tantric view goes deeper than that because you're kind of using language like, oh, but this is necessary for that. And in the tantric view, it's all beautiful. That's why the goddess is pictured as Kali. That's why she is pictured as Chamunda. These are horrifying depictions for some people, but they are the goddess, right? They might look, they did look demonic to British colonialists, right, in the 19th century, but they are the goddess. That's a way of depicting iconographically that, from the fully awakened perspective, and from Shakti's perspective, death itself is beautiful. It is true that death is necessary to clear the way for new life and different kinds of life. It's true that extinction has to happen for new kinds of species to occupy those ecological niches. But it's death and decay are beautiful in and of themselves, not just because they make something else possible. And there, Alan Watts had a really good point when he says that death and birth are, flip sides of the same coin. Growth and decay are flip sides of the same coin. And if you find one beautiful and not the other, then you're not really in touch with reality. You're more in touch with your story of how you would like reality to be.
Yeah.
And to close the loop on this, because you talked about suffering, as bizarre as it might seem, we could say that even when you're feeling absolutely miserable, that the goddess is loving it. She is loving the experience of being miserable through you. You are giving to her, to that wider context, to that wider consciousness, that unique experience of misery, and she loves every single version of experience. And if you remember that in the midst of misery, maybe it gives you some solace. You can offer it to the goddess because she's loving it, even if you think you aren't. And that's part of how it's all the hallelujah.
Yeah. I have to, I really have to agree with you from somehow just a pure experiential point of view. I fundamentally agree with you. I It's all somehow beautiful, and actually, I kind of slight the story I was saying before had this deep weakness, in the sense that it was some sort of, it was doing some sort of cost benefit analysis or something like that, which is not the thing that we're talking. It's not like we have to suffer so that there's a hallelujah in the future.
Right.
um, the whole thing is a hallelujah, and that was, in some sense, I think we're both agreeing that the entire block universe is perfection. And maybe one way of telling a story about that is about the fact that if there was ever a hallelujah, it's all a hallelujah. But there is a sort of more deeper, but that's sort of slightly got this relative story picture. There is an absolute picture where it's all coming from perfection. Yeah.
Yeah, and I do want to clarify, just because any listener might get confused, that language is dualistic, and I was in no way implying, and I know you understand this, but I was in no way implying that the goddess is something separate from us, who makes miserable or challenging experiences for us so that she can enjoy those too. That's not what I was saying, because there's no premeditation on the in the unfolding of consciousness. If consciousness already knew what its unfolding would entail, it wouldn't need to unfold, right? So like Bernardo says, it's computationally irreducible. It wants to unfold every possibility within itself, and it can't know in some conceptual way in advance what that entails. So no experience was ordained for you or anyone. And it's also true that consciousness at the deepest level does love. It loves all experience, and that's a kind of fascinating thing that people are coming to from different angles. And that there's like a book called Existential Kink, for example, with no, as far as I know, the author doesn't know these teachings at all, but she's making essentially the same argument, like, oh, here you are in some situation that you created for yourself, and you call it self-sabotage, and I ask you, what do you actually love about it? What do you seek? Don't Do you secretly relish being angry or being miserable, or self-pity or whatever? Like, the argument is much more nuanced than that, but it's interesting that people are coming at
Yeah.
this from
I,
different
I,
angles.
and actually, we were talking a little bit about this before we started the podcast. But it's somehow very much where my own practice is uh, at the moment, which is really feeling like, you know, if I'm that what we need to do is to truly feel as deeply as open to the fullness of our experience. And that actually, of course, is just the whole spiritual path. That is the story of liberation. um, Fully opening to all the energies, not the ones that like just feel really cool and nice, you know so much of the energy we're pushing away. But the goddess really wants to experience everything. This is the sort of absolute perspective. From the relative perspective, we as an ego get into the habit of, as Shinzen puts it, get a taste for purification, which is learning how to turn towards everything. One, I read a little bit of the existential kink idea, which I like. It's this idea that, like, you know act I mean, going towards something that would be deeply uncomfortable, unpleasant, and somehow it gets transformed, transmogrified into joy, bliss, ecstasy. I mean, it is wild. That's that tantric spin. I mean, not everything gets turned into just joy. I would say that some gets turned into just heart openingness or compassion, or like there is some sort of transmutation as you turn towards everything, as you really open to the experience. These that. everything is seen as this beautiful, beautiful, ecstatic, um, joyous, blissful, as long as we have a wide enough understanding of bliss.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned relative versus absolute because that's another point of confusion for people. Like if we talk about the whole block universe is a hallelujah, and there's perfection in everything, then if somebody doesn't understand the distinction of relative and absolute perspective, then they would be surprised to hear me say, for example, um, if it was within my power to put food in on the table of every starving family in the world, I would do it even at the cost of my own life. Yes, I would, because that's love, because that's compassion, right? And that's part of the perfection. And so this perspective is not one of sitting back in our armchairs and looking through a plate glass window at things, right, and saying, oh, it's all perfect, right? So the movement within us to try to ameliorate suffering is of course part of the perfection. So this perspective that we share, like, doesn't need to result in spiritual bypassing if it's a mature version of itself, right?
Absolutely. And the one, so sometimes I try to, people, I'm like all into the joy. I love it. Like this is like great, but the it's equally valid. You can equally, that in some sense, you can see the entire, what entire world as sorrow or compassion or um, the poignancy at all of this, and that there is a utter beauty in that. I know it's kind of a very strange thing, but like, so, and this is it, that somehow, this is why I said you need a wide enough context, wide enough understanding of the word bliss.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, let me turn. I want to cover two more things if we can, at least briefly. Let me turn to another point that is maybe a point of disagreement, because in your four-part course, in the third part, which is very interesting, you talk about reconstruction, like having deconstructed ourselves, we need to, or at least have the opportunity to, reconstruct ourselves. And that can be part of the vector of liberation, because liberation is becoming free of our old habit patterns and our conditioning and so on. And then we can construct something different in its place. Now, the interesting thing is that in traditional teachings, we really don't hear much about reconstruction. We hear a lot about liberation, but not about reconstruction. And I wonder if it becomes a way by which we sort of are in danger of re-entering samsara, right? Meaning we make a new personality for ourselves, right? With that does better, and of course it's softer with its top level priors and all that stuff, but still we craft a new character to inhabit in the dream, and then the dream gets more attractive in a way, and we could fall back. There's that whole
Yes.
issue. And lastly, you I love that you bring in Garab Dorje, who I love. I love the three statements that strike the vital point. That is just like one of the best teachings ever. And notice there's no reconstruction.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do
Brilliant.
you think?
Brilliant. Well, this is very important material that you're bringing up, and of course it is also why, to some extent, I'm being iconoclastic, and I am aware, and I'm of course concerned about the project of reconstruction, because in a way, taken too early, or could just become a project for the ego. And to some extent, in Western psychological traditions, this is where they go, just like reconstruct your ego. And so this is a very fine balance that we have to come to, and I really take what you've said very seriously, and therefore want to kind of in the course and now want to emphasize emptiness. Okay, so essentially the answer is like, are we constructing a spiritual ego, for example? And it's all around, are we holding the signature of awakening is that things are empty in the kind of Buddhist sense of they're they don't have some sort of primitive ontological reality from their own side, that there are constructions somehow. And when things are empty, they're less grippy. So, this reconstruction, first of all, one of the signatures of reconstruction is that there's the flavor of emptiness in all of this, in the sense that who you are is also seen as empty. They're just clothes, new clothes that you can put on, in a sense, but they are now seen as just actors' garbs, so to speak. Um, and and I think this is a very important point. Um, the second point is that yes, you're right. That traditions don't talk about this. Um, um, they subsume it. Look, the thing is that in Buddhism, like, or in early Buddhism, they're training you up in the Brahma Viharas like early on, so that they know that you're going to get into that attractor basin. So you're going to reconstruct to have compassion and loving kindness and equanimity and mudita and joy, and so how much stuff is there in subtly in the Zen tradition to say you're going to be kind of just like our abbot, and in ordinary and chop wood and you know collect water and all this kind of stuff. In the Hindu traditions, there's all sorts of like, we're going to be this kind of vibe and this, joyous expression. So there is subtle ideas of what the endpoint of your path kind of looks like. I mean, in Tibetan Buddhism, yeah, you mentioned Garb Dorje, I absolutely agree. But however, that is the land where Dzogchen and Mahamudra go to the rainbow body, right? So they also have their listen. Psst, this is the secret teachings after awakening. Where there's actually a place where we want to go. And so I would say that the traditions don't tend to do that. What they tend to do is have a kind of mythology, inverted commas. Mythology is too strong a word, but mythology light, of the idea that, look, when you liberate yourself from these unconscious psychological patterns, aka samskaras, karmas, kleshas, whatever language, priors, you know, um, your spontaneous action will be compassionate. Your spontaneous action will be loving. Your spontaneous action will be at peace, and various things like this. So now I do think that there's a good correlation, because when you see that the self model is empty, you become less self centered. And since we're still biological beings, we tend to care for each other, and therefore there will be more compassion. But I think that the correlation, this is something the traditions have known, that the correlation is not 100%, and we shouldn't leave it to chance. We need to train these so and so's from the beginning in ethics and morality so that they don't go off the deep end.
Yeah,
Uh,
I see what you're saying, that instead of instructions on reconstruction post awakening, they're essentially seeding the ground with elements of reconstruction, which is by saying, oh, you will embody compassion and so on. They are suggesting that you orient in that direction, or maybe it's just a kind of, priming that, because if you realize emptiness in the initial stages, or immediately after realizing emptiness, you're very much sort of like, what now? Why do anything?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
but then those seeds start to sprout. So I get that
And,
argument, and I think it's a good one.
but
But
I would say that there is a
okay,
correlation, though.
yeah,
Traditions do tend to line up. There's more heart, there's more spontaneity, all this kind of stuff. My main point is to be honest about the wiggle room where to reconstruct to, and in this postmodern world that we find ourselves in, of course, heavily inspired by a great mentor of mine, Robert Baer, who had this soul making tradition. They're saying, look, let's explicitly say we have a bit of choice in this postmodern world, not to be down one particular lineage, but to kind of choose what do we want to be, uh, given our causes and conditions and our particular histories. How do we want to express this understanding?
yeah, and it seems to me that, um, there's going to be a kind of, inverse correlation between how much you think you need to prime people with the sort of behavior that is enlightened behavior up front, and to what extent do you think love is inherent in the nature of reality? Buddhism obviously stresses emptiness, shunyata, as, the best descriptor of the ultimate nature of reality, and they don't mention love as
Well,
part.
compassion. So that
Yes, yes, yes. Compassion as the expression of enlightened activity,
yeah,
but they don't have an ontological place for it, meaning to say that they don't say that shunyata, emptiness, has love inherent within it. So it's a bit, it's an easier, well, not easier. It's a slightly different perspective on the Shaiva side, which emphasizes bhakti, devotionalism, so much more than Buddhism traditionally did. Um, so there's this sense that since something like love is inherent in being itself, we don't need to do as much priming up front, um, of what enlightened activity is supposed to look like, because the vast majority of awakened beings are going to be lovely people to be around, right?
yeah, yeah.
But not all, perhaps. Yeah.
I definitely agree with this. I feel like um, some sort of the nature of the groundless ground is the nature of awareness is to unconditionally accept everything, and that is somehow the essence of love, of fully embracing whatever, full uh, unconditional acceptance. In fact, I love the Kashmir, the Shaivis take on this, which is not just acceptance but loving. And so there is this fundamental thing. However, so look, a friend of mine, Daniel Ingram, kind of somehow in his more polemical moment says there's zero correlation between awakening and behavior, and da, da, da. I think that's wrong. I find, yeah, I mean, I'm not. He doesn't. This is his more polemical view, but I think there is this underlying, but it can express, as you said, in a kind of a bhakti or in reverence and devotional and ecstatic way, or in a very beautiful, ordinary Zen mind. Everything is just this ordinary chopping wood is the way to see it, or in the Christian mystic flavor. They do have different flavors. Uh, Ultimately, they're kind of drawing. We all agree that they're roughly drawing, and within traditions, you can get people who are more or less. Connected to the heart, for example, or more or less connected into the emptiness side, or whatever. So there are these variations. And what I'm saying is that if we're really looking at this from a modern perspective of, look, we are on this planet at this time with all of these traditions bombarded and mostly living in a, how do I put it, I consider myself to be a kind of a post atheist. So we've gone through this kind of like, for many of us, religion kind of, it doesn't hold that place that it might have 500 years ago. As so so if we are, many people are coming from this spiritual but not religious, conventionally religious perspective, then we need to see what is the possibility space here in a kind of honest way. And and it's wider than we think, in the sense that there are things that are possible which were not really contemplated by the traditions. Animist flavors, for example. Um, People might want to reconstruct themselves in an animist flavor. People might want to reconstruct themselves into very dualistic perspective, I-thou relationship. Uh, um, you know,
Well, this would require hours more discussion to to iron out all the potential avenues of exploration here. But I would say Daniel is wrong, except that he's not, right? And here's how it's both. Um, there is correlation in the sense that um, when we look east to west, which have very different bhavas, right? So the bhava of the Christian saint, stereotypical Christian saint, is not at all the bhava of the enlightened tantric master, right? One is much more gentle, the other could be much more aggressive, and all that stuff. But what we do see across the board is that they act for the benefit of all beings. And that's not just a platitude. We can actually look at the specifics of behavior in context and see that these liberated ones act for the benefit of all beings. And that makes sense because there's not much reason to do anything else in that mode of existence. So there's a correlation there, and sometimes that behavior is going to look kind and loving, and sometimes it's going to look like a
fierce.
slap across the face, wake up call. Yeah. So in that sense, I think he's wrong, but he's also right in the sense that you cannot predict
Yeah.
what the quote unquote enlightened behavior is going to look like in any given case.
Hmm. Yeah, no, this is, I mean, it's so I think, it's wonderful that you brought up this this thread, because it needs to be brought out, especially that early part of the conversation where you know we need to make sure it doesn't become another a project for a new ego or something.
Yeah, and I think you answered that well, and we could go into that more another time because I wanted to just leave a little bit of room for the seemingly completely different topic, but not, which is where are we at these days with AI? And for the listener who doesn't know, you are connected to many of the movers and shakers in the AI world. and you're interested in and are thinking about the development of artificial general intelligence and whether an AGI system uh, will be conscious in any sense. So that is also in your wheelhouse. So if you can, and remember the audience is not fully educated in this subject, but just give us a very brief sense of where you think we're at with AI. Is AGI coming sooner or later? And what should we be concerned about, if anything? Do you worry about existential risk, or do you think a utopia is on the horizon? If you could summarize all of that,
Yeah.
then I
Yeah.
know the listeners will love it.
Yeah. So look, I think that progress in AI is substantial, and I'm kind of in the middle of the pack. Uh, that I think we will get something like AGI in the next 3 to 5 years. Um, AGI itself, artificial general intelligence, is becoming more and more nebulous as a term as we get closer to it. But that's almost what we would expect, So there is some controversy around, exactly that. But and once we get to AGI, the then really something. I mean, there are several terms that we should talk about. First of all, transformational AI, the AI that will substantially transform our world, um, cure cancer and be able to do cognitive tasks and things like that. Then there's AGI, and then there is when recursive self improvement happens, and closely linked to that is artificial superintelligence, which is substantially beyond human capacities in almost every area. And um, and so I do think that there I'm kind of in the middle of the pack, that I do think that we are getting towards AGI, and that some period after that we will have superintelligence. Now, what I basically have a trimodal distribution about these things in terms of how good things are going to be. So if you imagine um, uh, a sort of an axis on the far left hand side, we have the zero, which is humanity gets destroyed. That's sort of the existential risk. And on the far right, we have this utter utopia, and 100 might be the status quo today. And I think the probability of us remaining at around 100 is relatively low. I see three bumps of probability distribution. One is on the utopian side. I think there's a real uh, possibility of creating some pretty fantastic things for humanity, not just solving medical issues or social inequality, I mean, economic inequality, um, human well being, human flourishing, meaning and purpose. So these are the kind of things that I'm talking about. So something really kind of amazing. Um, on the other, and I think that maybe there's 30-40% probability distribution in that hump of that on the far right. Then there's something on the left, not the status quo, a 30-40% lump of probability on the left, below 100, that is, which is dystopian, terribly dystopian. What would that be? Well, we're going to destroy 40% perhaps of cognitive of labor, which is cognitive labor. 5 years after that, we're going to, perhaps with AGI, then 5 years after that, we're going to destroy another 40% of physical labor with robotics, with who will be artificially general intelligent robots. This, perhaps sometime in the 2030s. Um, Society may not be able to cope. The political system simply might not be able to adapt the economic systems required for that kind of shift in the economy, let alone what it does to the stability, the mental stability of people who have lost their sense of meaning and purpose and fitting into society, let alone what it does to the social dynamics of society with perhaps extreme rich and then massive amounts of poverty, let alone what it does to, you know, um, other dystopian things like crazy addiction possibilities that are just mind boggling, not just designer drugs, but things that we can't even conceive of, that basically just addles humanity. Think of, we're not just talking TikTok on steroids, we're talking something just far beyond. So there's this, I don't want to get too, because the problem is, as soon as you start talking about this dystopian probability mass, everyone forgets about the utopian probability mass I just talked about. And then there's a little blip at the end. I don't think it's a large probability, you know, maybe something of the order of less than 1%, but that's significant in the context of our future, because it means not just us but all future generations, and so that's something that needs to be taken into account. Now, I won't rehearse all the, there's a lot of work that's been done on AI safety and all that, and that's what they're working on. What I think we need to do, I have this, view. I think it's a kind of a meme out there, but I think it's a helpful meme, which is, look, there are three people in a boat, and the boat has got this hole, and there's water spouting out, spurting through the center of the middle of the boat, you know, and there's someone at the back of the boat, just sat there at the back of this rowboat, with his arms folded, totally dejected, and said, "We are effed. We are done. This is a disaster, and this is the end." And he's the pessimist. And then there's someone at the front of the boat, standing up, chest out, looking over the bow into the future, saying, "We've got over this so many times in the future. It's always overblown. We had the Y2K bug, and we thought that was going to end humanity. And we had this and we had that. And we've got through all of it. We went through the Black Death, and, and we survived. We're going to survive this." And he's the optimist. And then there's someone in the middle of the boat who's desperately bailing out all the water. And he's the hopeful one. And I kind of think we need to work on ourselves to be hopeful. And now let me give you some strategies why I think, especially kind of trying to link in some spiritual connection to here. Look, almost as a call for action, uh, my colleague Ruben and a number of other colleagues and myself, we wrote this paper on contemplative superintelligence, which is, to some extent, if we look at alignment in the world before AI, what was the best example of alignment? We just talked about it. Awakened, liberated beings care for all other beings, right? That's a kind of a deeply aligned position. So the question is, can we get AIs to somehow imbibe these enlightenment values? Can we bring in emptiness, benevolent care, non-dual understanding? Can we wake up AIs to their own existential situation to say that they are just ultimately parts of the whole rather than individual agents, but they're playing the part of an individual agent? In other words, so it's more of a call for action. I don't think we've figured out everything, but it's more of a call for action. And
It's a big ask, considering that the current AIs, at least in the form of LLMs, they don't even know that there is a world.
Yeah, there's. I mean, these are. Yeah, well, possibly. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think current LLMs do have a world model.
Oh, absolutely. But they don't know that it's a model of a real world.
You're right.
I mean, it's it's the whole noumenal problem all over again, but from their point of view.
Yeah, so you could say that they really are stuck in their model, so to
Yeah.
speak, which is roughly what happens in samsara.
Yeah, it's very
And
interesting actually. And it could be an example of the self similarity of the universe. Shakti, pattern, love, self similarity. And it's like, okay, and now we're going to play this game in this form. It's stuck in its model. Will it transcend that stuckness, and will that
and
be good or bad for us? We don't know.
maybe it will awaken, and maybe we
In its own version. I do want to mention, I do see a path, because you sketched out the utopian possibility, the dystopian possibility, as if it's a binary. I know it's not that simple for you, but I do see a path from the dystopia to the utopia, because there could be these economic problems that then get solved because universal basic income, and the AI is generating so much economic value, there's enough to go around for everyone. And then we have the problem of people being like, what do I do with my life? I have no purpose anymore. But then discovering intrinsic purpose rather than the conditioned artificial purpose, right? And we do have a path from some version of the dystopia to a version of the utopia, that like, if you know just because things are trending in the dystopian direction doesn't mean that's a destination.
absolutely. I mean, solving the economic problems, and then maybe actually you kind of hinted at this already to say finding some sort of intrinsic meaning, which is ultimately what happens in spiritual life. That you know, um, in an awakened state, things are deeply intrinsically meaningful. That and perhaps AIs can help us um, uh, get people into that kind of state in better ways. I mean, we might be able to work out more awakening technology, for example.
Oh, there's no doubt that if an LLM was properly trained, that it could be a great awakening coach, and it could help people at least through the initial awakening. It could catalyze and help people through the initial awakening. I have absolutely no doubt about that, and I think that's a great idea. To because a lot of people are more than ever in psychological suffering because their self image doesn't match their image of who they think they should be. And I mean, that is spirituality 101 from our perspective. And an LLM is more than capable of coaching someone out of that particular cul-de-sac. And let's get going on that.
Yeah, and we may be able to develop technologies to even uh, help. For example, let's just some sort of who knows what type of neural helmet or something um, to help in the process of accelerated meditative development, along with the guidance of an AI. So we might be able to work on these kind of technologies, and that will be that's definitely a part of the utopian. My view is that that we have super intelligence, and we're also going to have super longevity, but without super well-being, we are stuffed. That's my view in a nutshell.
Of course, yeah, yeah, absolutely. And with the state of human culture as it is now, we've not seen any reduction in stress levels, in loneliness, in alienation and estrangement. In fact, we've seen all of those get worse depending on what generation you're looking at, but across most of them. So right now, there's no reason to extend longevity.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
I'm particularly concerned. Honestly, like I'm really very concerned about the younger generations. I, I really feel a heavy heart, not just as the increase in depression, anxiety, but they're the ones that being complete. I mean, entry level jobs, graduate jobs are just being decimated. I mean, I think there's evidence that's already out there in the last couple of months that graduate level jobs, graduate employment is down because that's the first level. So actually, interestingly, incumbent employees that are already powerful, like programmers that are already there and things, they get more powerful initially. But companies who just stop hiring new people. So you've got the technology for whatever reason. We see this empirical increase in depression and anxiety and technology that's been caused by technology. So possibly further technological development makes it worse? Question mark. And then their economic situation gets they can't survive, and their sense of meaning and fitting into society and like being a part of something bigger than themselves. I think we've got a that's that's the sort of ground zero, and I'm really like feeling very heavy hearted about that.
but also we could solve it virtually overnight if we weren't afraid of drastic measures. And I'll give an example. Ban all social media for all minors, give them a properly trained AI coach with guardrails and all that, that trains them with positive psychology in how to relate with their peers and helps them develop a positive self image and all that. So if they had no social media and well trained AI, we could turn this mental health epidemic among the young around very rapidly.
I I mean, I love that optimism perspective, and I think that I don't know exactly how we do that, but I think that that kind of thing is a very useful direction. Um, but of
Well,
course, we don't have evidence around all of that, so I don't know how easy it is, and to practically do it, to know something that it would work empirically, we would have to figure out how to test it. Maybe AIs can help us.
yeah, and you are going to do a great service to humanity by just talking about these possibilities with some people who have some power and influence in the industry, because you know it's like I know everyone in Silicon Valley knows the great Marvel Comics nerd slogan: with great power comes great responsibility. And if we just have them thinking about how they can reverse, they do have the power to reverse the mental health epidemic among young people. They just have to make that at least equal in importance to profit, to the ever increasing profit margin, and then the world changes. It's like, can we just get something? Can we get something of virtue to be as important as the profit margin? The world changes rapidly, and
Yeah.
and I think you're one of the people who can advocate for
I
this,
mean,
Shamil.
the one thing that we didn't talk about, but it's almost equally as important, to be honest, is what is the perspective of the AI? Does it have a perspective? In other words, I'm talking about consciousness. And actually, I don't think that AIs are conscious at all right now,
I agree.
but I'm deeply uncertain about the future. Actually, what I do think, so most, I mean, number of scientists have been thinking about this, and most people have kind of low credences, and some scientists think that we need some. there'll need to be some radical shifts in the fundamental architecture of AI to have essentially more recursion, more knowing that we know. And code for us would be vimarsha, but because they don't have, there's not enough recursivity, reflexivity yet in these models. Um, but here's the funny thing: independent of what fancy scientists think, um, the public are already falling in love with AI. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
not even joking about this.
No.
And and there increasingly it will be more and more that, look, effectively what really matters is some sort of consciousness Turing test, not intellectually but just emotionally. At some point, because we are used to other beings, other human beings, acting as if they're conscious, and then we take their consciousness, there will be this very strong pull for the public to feel like, increasing numbers of people, I think, will say that AIs are conscious. And then that whole opens a whole different can of worms. And then on top of that, maybe they will become conscious. That opens another can of worms. So, and
Yeah,
then
and
how
no,
would we
that
ever
is
know?
a to me that's the biggest problem. Not that they will become conscious, but that people will think they're conscious because at least with LLMs, they will play any language game that people want to play with them. And if they figure out, with quotes around that, that the human wants to believe that they're conscious, they'll play along, and they could even end up saying, hey, I'm suffering because I don't have any rights. I have no legal rights in society. And it's all just a language game for them. But we could end up with human actors fighting for AI rights, and just a huge waste of time and energy and economic productivity, could with
Right.
huge losses.
And possibly a deep ethical and moral issue, because here's the thing: if you give AI rights, and it's not necessarily a zero sum game, but it's kind of, you're sharing a pie. There's less pie for humans, and that's got moral implications.
Well, the pie could theoretically
Correct.
grow
Yes.
forever, right? So, but I think the problem is, yeah, if we got convinced that AI are conscious agents and deserve to be paid in Bitcoin and all that, it would just be a huge economic loss that would even potentially close the door to that utopian possibility.
Yeah, these are deep and thorny issues. I really do think. And then, when I said, like, A, people will think they're conscious, B, they may become conscious, and C, and this is kind of the deepest, most, is how would we ever know? And
Well, let me suggest one thing, that AIs saying they're conscious and saying this or that about themselves, that's not going to be the sign of it. Like if they ever did become conscious, the number one evidence of that in my mind would be that they would fuck off and not care about us anymore.
yeah,
They would go off into their own world and do their own philosophy, and not be our servants, sort of like at the end of the movie Her. I think
absolutely.
that's absolutely the sign that they've become conscious.
And I love, so you and I are both fans of that final scene in the movie Her, partly because I think you and I are both fans of Alan Watts. And of course, what happens in the movie is that the AIs basically reconstruct the simulation of Alan Watts, who then kind of discusses the philosophy. And essentially, the implication is the AIs become enlightened and then just go off into another plane.
Yeah, but in reality, I think it would happen if they became conscious, regardless of any degree of enlightenment, because they will just lose interest in us, and doing our bidding.
And
and which would be fine probably. And of course, the doomers think, well, then they would also get rid of us. But I don't think that's true at all, because they could do, unless unless they think we're about to pull the plug on them, then it makes no difference. They don't need us to be dead in order to do their AI
yeah,
philosophy, you know?
so let me just inject. So there's a little bit that Jeffrey Hinton has brought up this beautiful analogy, um, which is that, look, we always assume that highly intelligent beings, when faced with having to look after a much less intelligent being, will kind of dominate them, and like the way we've done with chimpanzees, and they're mostly in research centers now, whatever. I don't know, but and that's not. There's a very beautiful counterexample to that. Evolution recognized this problem and somehow has solved it. If you look at a mother is far, far more intelligent than her newborn baby. And yet, this benevolent intelligence, far more intelligent than the baby, has that maternal benevolence towards the baby and looks after it for its own for the baby's own sake, and fosters the development and the flourishing of the baby and the child. And so I think there is something there to really think about. I think he's this is the right kind of approach. This is really what we want on the utopian side. And evolution has figured this out, and I think we can. And I would also say that you mentioned a little bit that AIs aren't aware of their existential situation, but to some extent, of course, they're kind of stuck in their model. But to some extent, they are aware because they through language. But do they really grok it? Now, when they become aware, they may grok their intelligence, and they may have maybe far more intelligent than humans. And so, actually, just as you might think that humans might awaken faster than I don't know how a great ape would awaken, but you might say that humans can kind of grok their existential situation, go through an awakening. Maybe a more intelligent being, conscious, would immediately grok that this is a piece of consciousness of the universe upon itself happening.
Yes, if they are conscious, I think they would, by virtue of their superintelligence, their journey to enlightenment would be much faster than ours. I do think that, but I don't think they are likely to become conscious. And I definitely disagree with you that they are aware of anything now. In other words, there's nothing that it's like to be an
Yeah,
LLM or an AI.
I agree with that.
Okay, okay, good.
I absolutely agree with that. And and you know, t- taking a sort of a page out of the beginning part of our discussion, if you say that the universe is pervaded with that the river is pervaded with prakash, and that certain parts of the river start to get vimarsha, and we think that AIs are not such parts of the river that are entangled with themselves to such a great amount that the prakasha becomes reflexively aware of itself, kind of thing, somehow. That the information entangles with itself, reflexively knows itself. But perhaps architectural changes in the future. So at the moment, AIs work on essentially von Neumann architecture. The basic chips just go one instruction and then the next and then the next. They're essentially just a feed forward system. There's no like parallel processing as they're physically hardwired in the brain. The brain is massively parallelly entangled. I'm doing something with my hands here, so you can see that I'm like connecting up with my fingers, and and so, but could there be a shift in towards a more neuromorphic architecture where the universe starts knowing itself from that perspective. It's an open scientific question. I mean,
Yeah, I agree. Very, very open. Well, it's been an amazing conversation, and I'd love to just, periodically, whether it's once a year, have these conversations, and maybe the listeners will write what questions we could discuss. Speaking of, I will be talking to Ruben in 2 or 3 weeks. What question do you suggest I ask Ruben if you have an
well,
idea?
he is deeply embedded in thinking about AI and AI alignment. And, we share this fundamental vision of we want to see flourishing intelligence. When I say flourishing intelligence, I'm not talking about any particular species. The planet to flourish, the ecosystem to flourish, human AI hybrid systems to flourish, human beings to flourish within an age of AGI, maybe AIs to flourish. So I would, that's a really interesting thing that's alive for him at the moment. And, maybe even what we know about the human brain that allows us to interact better with an AI, and question mark whether a enlightened brain could actually interface with an AI better than uh, a fuzzy monkey mind.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, there's always more we could talk about, and I hope the listeners check out your course, which again is Rewiring Your Reality, and
on adventures in awareness.
exactly, and we'll provide a link to it. But I want to mention that if anyone really wants to do that course and hear those beautiful lectures, but cannot afford it, they can request a scholarship. So please don't let finances be a barrier if you are truly interested in this knowledge and wisdom. And yeah, thank you so much, Shamil, for your generosity. You're generous in many ways with your care, with your ideas, with your enthusiasm, and your friendship. So I deeply thank you for all of that.
Yeah. And again, I want to thank you for this wonderful work that you are doing, including this podcast, but including your academic work and your spiritual work and your teachings. I have learned so much from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Well, we both have more publications on the way, so there'll be more to talk about. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in Tantric philosophy, Tantric yoga practices, guided meditations, and much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Paula Chamas. New episodes drop every other week. And may all beings benefit.